Hi guys, this is Creative Cuts, a channel where I build, paint and create things. And so we're back with another episode of my Orc Army Diaries, where I go through my process and share some of my thoughts about starting a new army. And I got a comment from episode 1, link above if you haven't seen that, where the viewer couldn't have said it better. The orcs go wah, and the printer goes brrrr. Never a truer word has been spoken. This is the first time I've really lent into the 3D printing process and seem to have my settings dialed in, so I'm literally filling each print plate with as much as I physically can, press print and go straight into setting up the next plate. In episode 1 I spent lots of time looking for suitable files and doing a bunch of test prints to get a feel for what kind of models I like best, and then also their scale. Now that most of these decisions have been made, it was time to go crazy. Now most people may really follow a codex to build specific lists, but I just started printing models that I thought looked cool. I can always find ways to fit these into my army. And in between the printer running non-stop, I had a production line of models quickly building up, waiting to be painted. So in the evenings, I was also keeping things moving by getting the rest of my boys painted up with block colours, ready to be oil washed, and yet painting endless boys can get a little monotonous. So I also printed out a bunch of war bosses to mix things up a bit. I blocked in some colours and realised that I had a couple of scaling issues, as the bosses from one brand of miniatures were slightly smaller than the boys I'd painted up. Well, that's not going to work out, is it? In my head, an orc war boss should appear bigger and badder than your regular boy. So, back to the drawing board and rescale some of the prints, and of course I went the other way and ended up with a war boss that was far too big. Lessons learned, but amazing to have the freedom to scale all or just parts of a model so that it's just right. Now I also broke a few very fragile parts here and there, so I often printed out a few extras just in case. This meant that I quickly ended up with lots of spare parts that were unused. Some would see that as waste, but I just see more conversion opportunities. These ranged from something simple like adding some more lightning to this model, to fully scratch-built custom models, but more on that later. I also printed out some Stormboy alternate models, and because I picked up 2 sets, it was a ton of fun to mix and match between the 2 different sets to create my own variations. Interesting. Suddenly my brain juices were pumping, and I decided to get this heavy weapon set, close enough to flash kits that I could just adapt a little and these could work. Really nice chunky models, but in my opinion the guns needed a little bit more orky engineering, shall we say. Once I put the first 3 models together to get a feel for the parts, I then remixed another 3 models just using the leftover gun options and just let my imagination run wild. In true orky fashion, if it looks like it works and you believe hard enough that it will, in the world of orcs, that's plenty good enough. So I started adding bits and bobs until my inner big mech gave a grunt of approval. I also mixed up my favourite putty mix. It's a 50-50 mix of green stuff and milliput, giving you the best qualities of both materials, and then added some basic straps, filled a few holes and fine-tuned if any little areas that needed attention. And many people think that you can't really convert 3D printed resin models. Sure, the process and how you go about it is a little different. Resin is much more brittle than plastic, so it doesn't cut anywhere as easily, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. With a decent razor saw, a sharp pair of snips and some sanding sticks, you can come up with some really cool creations. I also realised that I found it easier to visualise my models once it had a little bit of paint on it. So I would mix up the usual process of doing all the conversion work first, and then prime and paint by adding a little bit of paint and then converting over the top of this. I also found that it was much easier to visualise my model in grey resin than transparent green. So when my previous batch of resin ran out, I switched to something more conventional. And this is when I'm at my most happiest. No plan, no rules, just letting your imagination flow, and time just seems to disappear. And I was so inspired by this process, I wanted to take things up a level. By now I had bought quite a few different STL kits with a wealth of options, and having spent so much time filling print plates, I'd become quite familiar with the parts that I liked, or at least I found interesting. I wanted some Lootas for my army, but I couldn't find any models that, really tickled me. So I thought I could scratch build my own. I loaded up a fresh print plate with a few body options, some gun barrels from a different set, and a few other various bits and bobs that I thought may well work together, but at this stage I had no real idea if they would work at all. This gave me a completely new way of working for me, essentially imagining a model in my head and then working out what parts might be needed, and then hopefully giving myself the options to make it happen. I thought the best way to go about this was to start with bits that I knew would fit together, like the torsos and the legs, and then slowly build on the model as it starts to take shape. I used some bits from the Stormboy set to begin making a backpack, and then worked off of this by adding some ammo boxes. I glued the gun barrels to the main body of the gun, and started to play around with how it could all fit together. Now this is very much a case of trial and error. There's no instruction manual, no guide to follow, but I found that breaking each small challenge into even smaller parts made thinking about the overall much easier. Work out how the gun fits together, for example. Then where on the model does the gun best sit? And then how ammo would feed into the gun. Work out each one of these parts, and before long, slowly a path reveals itself. And many people think that 3D printing is amazing because you can just print to your heart's content and just print armies and armies for free. And whilst this is partly true, I just wanted to talk about the hidden costs in 3D printing that are worth thinking about if you're going to attempt something like this. Firstly, you have to find the files. Now, there are many great websites offering STLs, but the better ones usually come with a fee. Sure, these will be certainly cheaper than buying official boxes from Games Workshop, but once you chuck a few sets together, these quickly add up. Then comes the cost of the actual resin. Again, not crazy expensive. I just use Elegoo's standard resin, which is around £13 per 1,000 grams. But I've been through at least 6 bottles already just to get to this stage. So again, it all adds up pretty quickly. Then you have the IPA to wash the models. Again, not super expensive, but adds up. Sure, you can recycle your IPA, but my wash and cure station swallows 5 litres of IPA like it's nothing. So add all this together and you're easily looking at over £100 spent on files alone. Another £100 in materials, and then add a bunch of time waiting for prints, etc. Something to bear in mind if you're contemplating getting into a project like this. Now my Lootas were looking pretty cool at this point, and I thought a final touch and a great way to hide any weird joints was to add a frame for the backpack gun combo. These didn't need to be uniform and could be adapted individually to the way each model it was posed. I was happy with the models that I'd created, but the real test of how successful my conversions were was to add a bit of primer and see how all the parts blended together. I hand painted the additional parts on my flash kits as these were partly painted already. Simple and not much to think about. And all that was left to do was batch prime the rest of my printouts with my airbrush. And as if the universe had aligned beautifully, I also received an email asking if I wanted to test out a new brand of airbrushes. I gladly accepted and was surprised when a couple of days later the airbrush arrived. Now I have 4 airbrushes that I've bought myself, all from Iwata, a company that sits pretty much along with Harder and Steinbeck as the industry leaders of the airbrush world. I run mine almost every day and have done for years, so the idea of switching airbrush for me was something I was pretty skeptical about. Enter Gregory, a new airbrush company to me. They sent me their Ace Series Swallowtail model to try out. Now, firstly, I was very impressed with how it was packaged. Care and attention to detail is always a nice touch. I also really welcomed a clear breakdown of the parts and their names, so getting replacements as and when should be very easy. They also make a point to advertise their customer support, so it seems like they have a great aftermarket support structure for you, which I know may seem obvious in this day and age, but I can't tell you how confused I've been at the start of my airbrushing journey, searching for the correct parts and ordering many wrong ones along the way. This model is their Jack of all trades model, which comes with a 0.28mm needle for precision detailed work, a 0.5, my go-to for everyday spraying, and a 0.7 needle for big terrain jobs, and all come with corresponding nozzles. It comes with 2 cup sizes, and the most interesting and slightly apprehensive thing was the trigger design. A big lever underneath, similar to what you may find on larger spray guns for painting cars, for example. Now, I've been using airbrushes for over 25 years and used to spray signs and sell custom t-shirts, spray motorbike tanks and bike helmets, long before I started using an airbrush for painting miniatures. With all this experience, the finger action of using an airbrush over the years, I've developed a muscle memory that is specific to each airbrush I use. And the airbrush pretty much just becomes an extension of my hand. I don't think about where my finger should go, it just does. So, I was a bit apprehensive about this new way of spraying. In terms of the brush, the build quality on the metal parts looks fantastic, and immediately I can see that somebody knows what they're doing has designed this airbrush. There were so many little quality of life things that will make this airbrush really easy to use. Now, there are a couple of plastic parts which, if I'm honest, feel slightly cheaper, but they're not really critical parts to the mechanics of the airbrush, so I can understand why they may have opted for plastic in these areas to keep costs down. Well, nothing left to do than to hook this baby up and run some paint through it. I keep everything as I normally would. Same Monument Hobbies black primer, which I thin with a few drops of water, and zap some models. What immediately jumped out to me was that I wasn't thinking. The whole grip trigger interaction felt so natural. I have quite big hands, so the grip feels fractionally smaller in my hand, if I'm honest. But I'm really splitting hairs here. It's a nice and light, well balanced, and I feel like I had much more control because of the longer trigger pull in relation to how far the needle goes back to allow paint out of the nozzle. Because there is a distinct finger position, it is much easier for the body to remember that finger position and develop that muscle memory. I went through the same basing process as I'd worked out from episode 1. Highlight, then shadow with some crimson red, some black green as a base for the skin, and then a bright yellow green over the top for the skin highlight, which makes them ready for painting in the rest by brush. And I realised I got so excited about seeing how my conversions had turned out with some paint on them that I completely forgot that I was using a new airbrush with a new mechanism, which for me is the best review I can give an airbrush. It does what you want, the paint flows effortlessly, it's comfortable to use, cleans up easily, and works the way it should. And all at a really affordable price point. This one retails at $114 US and ships to most places worldwide. Sure, I've used it once for what I guess you could call quite a heavy painting session, and it is the test of time really that will prove if this will become part of my permanent arsenal. But my honest first impressions are fantastic, and a really great option for someone looking to get into airbrushing, or someone who wants to add a solid airbrush that won't break the bank. And Gallery have been kind enough to supply me with a link, so you guys get an additional 10% off with the code CREATIVE, and I get a little kickback too, so it helps to support the channel. All links and details in the description below. And there we are. Gifted a nice surprise, melted my 3D printer, and got a ton of new minis ready to paint. I'm so thrilled with how my Lootas turned out, much better than I could have imagined. And it's got my creative juices well and truly flowing for what other possibilities there are for this army. Let me know what you think I should tackle next. I love hearing your suggestions, and also let me know if you like these kind of more informal diary pieces. Don't worry, I'll still be doing my usual diorama builds and have lots in store for you soon. If you want to stay up to date with future videos, then you can subscribe, hit the like button if you've enjoyed this video, and grab yourself a bargain and use the link below to snag yourself a nice bit of kit. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one.